Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 70 of Analyzing Evil, featuring Tywin Lannister, from A Song of Ice and Fire, and Game of Thrones. A terrifying man poised at the head of various power apparatuses in this brutal world, Tywin is one of the greatest fictional examples of a ruthless and pragmatic man who will do whatever it takes to ensure the continued prosperity and advancement of his family at the expense of anyone who dares to interfere with his machinations. However, Tywin is far from being alone when it comes to devious behavior, as horrifying actions done in service to advancing the power of the powerful at the expense of others is quite the common thing in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, and this story is rife with powerful men and women who sow great amounts of terror and misery in their own right. Men like Balon Greyjoy and his House of Reavers and Plunderers, Joffrey Baratheon and Ramsay Bolton, and their utterly disgusting sadism and cruelty, and of course, the Mad King Aerys Targaryen, a man who was quite fond of burning men alive for his own pleasure. Though these men and many more like them are presented to us in exceedingly horrific and diabolical ways, there are, in my opinion, 4 men who stand far above the rest in terms of villainy, at least in the age that this story takes place, and they earn these lofty positions at the height of villainy, not because of their in-your-face brutality, sadism, or insanity, though some of those qualities certainly play into it, but because of how sane and competent they are. How what they do is a result of their unbreakable wills, utter lack of morality, and the sheer scope of their plots, schemes, and actions that cause death and destruction for thousands without them ever having to lift a finger themselves. And those 4 are Tywin Lannister, Roose Bolton, Peter Baelish, and Euron Greyjoy. Well, the Euron we encounter in the books at least. However, Tywin stands tall above even these 3. All of them have far-reaching and sinister plans, and the lengths they're willing to go to see those plans become a reality are endless. Roose will do anything to solidify his hold on the North and prove himself a powerful lord who deserves fear and respect. Peter will do anything to claw his way onto the Iron Throne and gain everything in the world that he so desires. And Euron will do anything to learn the dark secrets of the world so he can mount it as a god of chaos and destruction. Tywin is much the same in his willingness to do anything to accomplish his goals, but he has something under his belt that these 3 have only claimed in a much smaller way when compared to his greatness: success. And not just success, but success on such a scale that there are few others who we can say have rivaled his nefarious achievements. And in this video, we're going to explore everything that made Tywin into the cold and calculating beast he is, a man who through sheer force of will elevated his house from the laughingstock of the realm to that of royalty. To accomplish this, we're going to be looking at everything we're given about Tywin in A World of Ice and Fire, the 5 books in the main series that have been released so far, and of course, the TV series. And to give this video some structure, we'll be looking at Tywin in 4 different sections that correspond to the most important eras of his life. Those being his first 20 years, his time serving as Hand of the King for Aerys Targaryen, his time spent as Warden of the West following Robert's Rebellion, and his time spent as Hand of the King to Joffrey and Tommen, before we sum up everything we've learned at the end of this video. But before we begin, let's get cozy with our sponsor for this video, Campfire. More than 150,000 writers use Campfire to organize, improve, and showcase their writing. Organize your stories in Campfire Write with over a dozen modules like character sheets, timelines, relationship webs, and a manuscript editor that lets you reference your notes while you write. Everything you create is private, safely stored in the cloud, and shareable so you can collaborate with friends. Improve your craft with Campfire Learn, their hub of educational resources, and when you're ready to reveal your creation to the world, you can showcase your projects in Campfire Explore to share your work with the community and build a following. Choose what parts of your project to share and craft a homepage to present your story. You can create an account for free and enjoy access to everything from the start. And if you're working on bigger projects in Campfire Write, you only have to pay for the features you need. Start a subscription for as low as 25 cents per month, or pay a one-time price with Campfire's a la carte options. Plus, Campfire just released their offline desktop app with even more updates on the way, like new modules, a mobile app, and the ability to monetize your writing in Explore. Write better stories faster with Campfire. Click the link in the description to learn more. Thank you, Campfire, for sponsoring this video. Now, without further ado, let's begin. Tywin Lannister was born in the year 242 AC to Tytos Lannister and his wife Jane Marbrand. Legend has it that the newborn Tywin bit his grandfather's finger when he ruffled his hair, an occurrence that would mark the first display of the innate ferocity Tywin held within him. We aren't given too much information about Tywin's early childhood, but it's been said by his sister Jenna that Tywin was big, even when he was little. And the only account we're given of his pre-teenage years seems to confirm this, as when Tywin was only 10 years old, his father proposed marrying off his sister to the second son of Lord Walder Frey, a proposition that many viewed as an insult, but one that no one had the courage to speak out against, save for the young Tywin, whose opposition to the match reportedly made his father turn as white as mare's milk and caused Lord Frey to quiver where he sat. Now, part of the reason that Tywin was such a fearsome child was because of his innate personality, but there's another element in his upbringing that caused this young man to behave in such a hard way. His father, Tytos, was known all across the realm as the Laughing Lion, an amiable and jovial man who could see the good in every man. And because of his good nature, he was a man who was easily taken advantage of. Where Lord Gerald Lannister, Tywin's grandfather, had brought House Lannister great prosperity during his reign, his son Tytos had the exact opposite effect, as he loaned out countless sums of gold to houses who only laughed at him when he asked for them to repay him, and his lax approach to ruling the Westerlands made it so thieves and robber knights could raid the countryside with near impunity. Being gentle and kind aren't bad traits to have, but problems arise when your kindness translates into cowardice, and by all accounts, Tytos Lannister was a coward. A man who would sooner laugh at any insult you threw at him rather than meet it with any kind of reproach. And not being a confrontational person isn't exactly a bad thing either, but people in positions of power can't afford to suffer slights like the ones levied at Tytos and expect to garner any respect from those that they rule. Now, Tywin, being a well-educated young lord, likely grew up receiving quite a few history lessons, and I'm sure many of those were centered around the storied history of his house. Tales telling of noble Lannisters like their progenitor Lan the Clever, or great kings of the Rock like Tybalt the Thunderbolt. But in his day there were no such heroes, no noble lions reigning over a fearsome pride. There was only his weak-willed father, the Laughing Lion. And because he was made to watch men of lesser houses ridicule his father as he blundered at nearly every chance he was given, Tywin grew resentful of the ruin that his father was bringing to his once great house, and by extension, resentful of his lack-wit father. So much so, that Tywin began to mistrust laughter, viewing it not as a jovial expression of one's mirth, but the bane of his house. It's for these reasons that Tywin constructed himself to be the opposite of his father in his person, as his father was the opposite of his own, in terms of his contribution to their house's prosperity. So the already stern-natured Tywin took his inherent traits to an extreme, becoming the dignified, well-mannered, and strong-willed man his father wasn't. And where other lordlings had men to emulate, Tywin needed only himself to guide him towards the path he believed he needed to take for the glory of his house. However, with Tywin being so young, and his father still the head of his house, voicing his concerns was the only course of action he could take, for the time being. To make matters worse, not long after Tywin called his father out for his poor judgment, he was sent off to King's Landing to serve as a page in the court of King Aegon V. Though this would enable his father to continue running their house, this opportunity to serve at court proved to be invaluable in shaping Tywin into the leader he needed to be. And here is where Tywin would first meet the young Prince Aerys, the future Mad King, and the heir to Storm's End, Steffon Baratheon, two men who could be considered Tywin's only true friends in his youth. And as chance would have it, his future wife and cousin, Joanna Lannister, served as a lady-in-waiting to Princess Rhaella for a time, which would be time spent together that I'm sure helped to move the impenetrable heart of Tywin Lannister towards a deep affection for her. Tywin would spend his time amongst the lords and ladies of the royal court until he was 18, gaining knowledge and experience that would prove invaluable to him as the future head of House Lannister. And at some point during this time period, Tywin would earn his knighthood. When the War of the Ninepenny Kings broke out in 260 AC, Tywin, his brothers Kevan and Tigget, and his friends Steffon and Aerys were sent off to join the fighting in the Stepstones, waging battle alongside legendary figures like Sir Barristan Selmy and Sir Gerald Hightower. The contribution that the Westerlands made in terms of men was substantial, as Lord Tytos had sent his brother Jason to the Stepstones with 11,000 men to fight in the war. However, this was seen as yet another cowardly move by Tywin, as it was his belief that a lord should accompany his forces to the battlefield, something the craven Tytos would never dream of doing. So now, after fighting in a year-long war, and living 8 years at court learning the ways of the world, Tywin resolved to return to Casterly Rock with his brothers to do what his father couldn't, assure the position of House Lannister as one of the premier powers in the Seven Kingdoms. To accomplish this mighty task, Tywin needed to restore dignity and respect to his laughable house, so he sent ravens to all the lords in the Westerlands who had taken loans from his father, and demanded that they either immediately pay back their debts, or send a family member to serve as a hostage, until there came a time where they were able to repay their debts. After which he sent out his brother Kevan with 500 knights to cleanse the Westerlands of robber knights and outlaws, as they went from keep to keep to demand repayment from these lords, orders that his meek father initially protested against, but he soon after fled to the comfort of his mistress, leaving his son to rule in his stead for the time being. Some, like Sir Harris Swift, chose to obey, and they promptly surrendered a hostage to the Lannisters, but more still chose to ignore these seemingly laughable edicts. chief among them being the Lords Roger Rayne and Walder Tarbeck, the heads of the failing, yet most powerful Lannister vassals. Lord Rayne simply gave no reply, but Lord Tarbeck took it a step further and rode to Casterly Rock, confident that he could cow Lord Tytos and force him to rescind his son's edicts. But Lord Tarbeck was met with a surprise. It was not Lord Tytos who greeted him, but his son Tywin, who promptly threw him into a dungeon. As stated in A World of Ice and Fire, Tywin surely assumed that the Tarbecks would yield once they had learned their lord had been taken captive, but quite the opposite happened, as Lady Ellen Tarbeck sent forces from Tarbeck Hall to kidnap several Lannisters, 3 members of the Lannisters of Lannisport, and Sir Stafford Lannister, son of Tywin's late uncle Jason Lannister, who died fighting on the Stepstones. This may have escalated to all-out conflict had it not been for Lord Tytos, as soon after he managed to steal himself away from his mistress long enough to mediate this conflict. That is, in Lord Tarbeck's favor, of course, releasing him from the dungeons and forgiving all of his debts to House Lannister, after which Lord Rayne hosted an impressive feast at Castamere, a feast where these lords gave their pledges of eternal friendship. But of course, that wasn't the end of Tywin's determination, and within a year, he sent out ravens to Castamere and Tarbeck Hall, demanding that Lords Roger and Walderin appear at Casterly Rock to answer for their crimes. And this action, as well as the events that would follow, when Tywin showed the world what kind of man and lord he truly was. As Tywin predicted, the Lords Tarbeck and Rayne refused to comply with his demands, instead sending letters declaring their intent to engage in open rebellion against their liege lords. Without asking his father for consent, Tywin called forth his banners and descended on Tarbeck Hall with an army consisting of 500 knights and 3,000 men-at-arms, catching Lord Tarbeck unprepared and giving him no time to marshal his own forces. What ensued was something quite common in Westeros, a battle between noble houses. But the aftermath of this battle is what separates Tywin from other lords. Other lords might have executed the rebellious Lord Walderin and installed his heir as ruler of their house, or perhaps they would plunder their lands to a certain extent and take a few hostages with them to ensure they wouldn't revolt again. Actions that might have provided the desired effect for House Lannister, as such an example being set in this world is often enough to curtail any thoughts of rebellion from other houses for the foreseeable future. But Tywin Lannister isn't your typical lord. He's the Lord, and he wants everybody to know what happens when you deign to challenge the true power of Casterly Rock. And to do that, he must ensure that his subjects feel one emotion above all others in their hearts when they hear the name Lannister: fear. A fear that's conveyed to us in a few pages from A World of Ice and Fire that I'd like to read for you now. In a short, brutal battle, the Tarbecks were broken and butchered. Lord Walderin Tarbeck and his sons were beheaded together with his nephews and cousins, his daughters' husbands, and any man who displayed the 7-pointed blue and silver star upon his shield or surcoat to boast of Tarbeck blood. And when the Lannister host resumed its march to Tarbeck Hall, the heads of Lord Walderin and his sons went before them, impaled on spears. At their approach, Lady Ellen Tarbeck closed her gates and sent forth ravens to Castamere, summoning her brothers. Trusting in her walls, Lady Tarbeck no doubt anticipated a long siege, but siege engines were readied within a day, and those walls proved little help when one great stone flew over them and brought down the castle's aged keep. Lady Ellen and her son Tion the Red died in the keep's sudden collapse. All resistance at Tarbeck Hall ended soon after, and the gates were thrown open to the Lannister host. Tywin Lannister then ordered Tarbeck Hall to be put to the torch. The castle burned for a day and a night, until naught remained but a blackened shell. The Red Lion arrived in time to see the flames. 2,000 men rode with him, all he had been able to gather in the short time available. Tywin Lannister had 3 times his strength, most accounts agree. Some insist that the Lannisters outnumbered the Raynes 5-1. Hoping that surprise might carry the day, Roger Rayne commanded his trumpets to sound the attack, charging headlong towards Sir Tywin's camp. After the first shock, the Lannisters recovered quickly, and their numbers soon began to tell. Lord Rayne had no choice but to wheel and flee, leaving near half his men dead upon the field. A rain of crossbow bolts chased his riders from the camp. One took Lord Rayne between the shoulders, punching through his backplate. The Red Lion rode on, only to fall from his horse less than half a league farther on. He had to be carried back to Castamere. The Lannister host arrived at Castamere 3 days later. Like Casterly Rock, the seat of House Rayne had begun as a mine. Rich veins of gold and silver had made the Raynes near as wealthy as the Lannisters during the Age of Heroes. To defend their riches, they had raised curtain walls about the entrance to their mine, closed it with an oak and iron gate, and flanked it with a pair of stout towers. But all the while the mine shafts had gone deeper and deeper, and when at last the gold gave out, they had been widened into halls and galleries and snug bedchambers, a warren of tunnels, and a vast, echoing ballroom. To the ignorant eye, Castamere seemed a modest holding, a fit seat for a landed knight, or small lord, but those who knew its secrets knew that 9/10 of the castle was beneath the ground. It was to those deep chambers that the Rains retreated now. Feverish and weak from loss of blood, the Red Lion was in no fit state to lead. Sir Reynard, his brother, assumed command in his stead. Less headstrong, but more cunning than his brother, Reynard knew he did not have the men to defend the castle walls, so he abandoned the surface entirely to the foe and fell back beneath the earth. Once all his folk were safe inside the tunnels, Sir Reynard sent word to Sir Tywin above, offering terms. But Tywin Lannister did not honor Sir Reynard's offer with a reply. Instead, he commanded that the mines be sealed. With pick and axe and torch, his own miners brought down tons of stone and soil, burying the great gates to the mines until there was no way in and no way out. Once that was done, he turned his attention to the small, swift stream that fed the crystalline blue pool beside the castle from which Castamere took its name. It took less than a day to dam the stream, and only 2 to divert it to the nearest mine entrance. The earth and stone that sealed the mine had no gaps large enough to allow a squirrel to pass, let alone a man, but the water found its way down. Sir Reynard had taken more than 300 men, women, and children into the mines, it is said. Not a one emerged. A few of the guards assigned to the smallest and most distant of the mine entrances reported hearing faint screams and shouts coming from beneath the earth one night, but by daybreak, the stones had gone silent once more. No one has ever reopened the mines of Castamere. The halls and keeps above them, put to the torch by Tywin Lannister, stand empty to this day, a mute testament to the fate that awaits those foolish enough to take up arms against the Lions of the Rock. Now, as was said in these pages, this is a harrowing reminder of the power of the Lions of the Rock, but the power of House Lannister is only a secondary assertion here, as the power of a great house without a man at the helm to utilize that power is like a hammer lying in the dirt, useless until someone picks it up, and useless still if that person hasn't the will to use it properly. Only when that power is manifested through the will of a person willing to use its full strength is its potential realized, and that is infinitely more important. Tytos Lannister held the immense power of his house within his grasp, but he was a man ill-suited to use it, a cowardly lion retreating from the greatness afforded him in favor of comfort and admiration. Tywin Lannister was no such coward, and as Sir Harris Swift said when Tywin first sent his ravens demanding repayment of all loans taken from House Lannister, the lion has awoken. This could be taken as a reference to the entirety of House Lannister, but I believe when Sir Harris specified a singular lion, he meant a singular lion, Tywin Lannister. Perhaps the greatest Lannister to ever sit at the helm of his house. No longer would the realm laugh at the house cats the lions of Lannister had been reduced to. Now they would know that there truly was a lion left to assert the vast power of his pride. A lion who commanded respect, fear, and even admiration. A lion who didn't believe in the half-measures taken by other lords when maintaining their power, but one who would not tolerate even a modicum of disrespect from his subjects, which we can see when the famous song written about Tywin's exploits during the Tarbeck Rain Revolt, the Rains of Castamere, was used by Lord Tywin as a simple yet effective tool to intimidate anyone who dared to show any hint of conflict with his interests, as Tywin only needed to send a single bard to the offending house and have them play that song at their court, showing them what horrid misfortune would follow if they dared to go through with their intentions to undermine his house in any way. Now, the thing you have to understand about Tywin's brutality is that he uses it as a tool of necessity, not as a source of cruel entertainment or satisfaction gained from the torture or deaths of his enemies. Where other barbaric kings and lords like Joffrey or Ramsay Bolton revel in the fear they inspire through the violent expressions of their power, Tywin, a man who we could say is almost entirely without joy, takes no joy in ending his enemies in such lavish shows of brutality either. He simply does it because it's extremely effective, because above all else, Tywin is the ultimate pragmatist, and that's perhaps the most dangerous aspect of his entire person. A complete devotion to the idea of pragmatism in the hands of a man who will do anything necessary to advance his own interests is the most terrifying thing imaginable. As a man who is able to disregard any sense of morality while also maintaining his sanity makes for a person who isn't an abhorrent sadist or a murderous madman, but a level-headed individual who can order entire villages to be put to the torch while giving that command as much thought as one would give to breathing. However, being an extreme pragmatist isn't all terrible, as having this mindset immensely amplifies a person's capabilities as a leader, and Tywin is no exception. Because his mind is centered around logic and rationality, Tywin is able to approach every situation presented to him in the most effective way possible. And this is one of the primary reasons why it's widely considered that Aerys II appointing Tywin as Hand of the King was the wisest decision he had ever made during his reign. Aerys was a hedonistic man with grand dreams that he quickly grew bored of. He wanted to build a second wall 100 leagues north of the existing one, and claim the lands in between. He wanted to build a white city entirely of marble on the south bank of the Blackwater, because he detested the stink of King's Landing. When a dispute with Braavos occurred, he declared he would build the largest fleet in history and bring the Titan to its knees, proclamations which quickly fell to the wayside as his interests were pointed from one item to the next, like a hummingbird flitting between flowers. On the other hand, Tywin was described as diligent, decisive, tireless, fiercely intelligent, just, and stern, and owing to this vast disparity in their personalities and actions, it was often said that Aerys wore the crown and Tywin ruled the realm. And how effectively he ruled the realm is described quite well by this passage in A World of Ice and Fire. It was Tywin Lannister who settled the crown's dispute with the Braavosi by repaying the monies lent to Jaehaerys II with gold from Casterly Rock, thereby taking the debts upon himself. Tywin won the approbation of many great lords by repealing what remained of the laws Aegon V had enacted to curb their powers. Tywin reduced tariffs and taxes on shipping going in and out of the cities of King's Landing, Lannisport, and Old Town, winning the support of many wealthy merchants. Tywin built new roads and repaired old ones, held many splendid tournaments about the realm to the delight of knights and commons both, cultivated trade with the free cities, and sternly punished bakers found guilty of adding sawdust to their bread, and butchers selling horse meat as beef. In all these efforts, he was greatly aided by Grand Maester Pycelle, whose accounts of the reign of Aerys II give us our best portrait of these times. All of these wide-reaching reforms and courtesies given to those in power earned Tywin respect outside of the respect he had already garnered from his show of force in the Westerlands. But there's an important distinction to be made here as to why Tywin made these decisions in the first place. Everything Tywin does is directly tied to his desire to supplant his house as the supreme power in Westeros, and the way in which he accomplishes this feat is nothing short of brilliant. Every policy, every word spoken, every action taken is all done for the betterment of his house, no matter the cost to others, which we can see in both the reforms he made upon ascending to Hand of the King and how he dealt with his enemies the Reynes and the Tarbecks. Tywin Lannister isn't wholly without empathy, but he is incredibly apathetic and unconcerned for the well-being of anyone who isn't a member of his house. That's not to say that Tywin hates the small folk or other lords. He simply doesn't care about them one way or another. Tywin sees people not as people, but as cogs in the machine that he's looking to take control of. And in order to do so, he must enmesh himself in the members of his house with the existing power structures, please his subjects and peers at certain times, and displease them at others. For example, as we learned earlier, Tywin declared that all bakers should immediately stop mixing sawdust into their dough, and all butchers stop selling horse meat as beef, or they would face severe punishment for their actions, which at face value seems to be a policy implemented out of concern for the well-being of the people of Westeros. However, if in that moment it were more advantageous to Tywin's plans to ignore these actions, I have no doubt in my mind that Tywin would turn a blind eye to these practices, or even encourage them. You see, a man like Ned Stark, whose moral compass is relatively sound, would have likely tried to circumvent these issues in any way he could, no matter the circumstances, as Ned is a noble man who's intimately concerned with the well-being of his people. But not Tywin. If his own interests were better served by people starving, he'd ensure they'd starve. And appeasing other lords with reforms aimed at improving their own power and wealth only occur on Tywin's watch because at that particular moment in time, it was in his best interest to earn the loyalty and admiration of these lords, not because he felt the need to provide even a minuscule amount of happiness and prosperity to others. The same could be said for his willingness to forgive all the crown's debts to the Iron Bank of Braavos by repaying them with his own funds and taking on the loan himself, as such an action moves the central power in Westeros, the royal family, closer and closer to House Lannister, to the point where they become dependent on their power, wealth, and resources more than any other house in the kingdom, just as Tywin intended. So yes, Tywin was an effective Hand of the King, but he was only as effective as he needed to be to ensure that his goals regarding the position of his house were realized. And perhaps because of this, he wasn't exactly loved for the effort he put into ruling the kingdom, though this is mostly because of his personality, and the attitudes his fellow lords and subjects had towards their hand is given to us in a passage from A World of Ice and Fire. Yet despite these accomplishments, Tywin Lannister was little loved. His rivals charged that he was humorless, unforgiving, unbending, proud, and cruel. His lord's bannermen respected him and followed him loyally in war and peace, but none could truly be named his friends. Tywin despised his father, the weak-willed, fat, and ineffectual Lord Tydos Lannister, and his relations with his brothers Tigget and Garyon were notoriously stormy. He showed more regard for his brother Kevan, a close confidant and constant companion since childhood, and his sister Jenna, But yet even in those cases, Tywin Lannister appeared more dutiful than affectionate. Even so, Tywin commanded respect from those around him, respect that King Aerys felt none of. And as could have been predicted by the attitudes towards both men at the time, Aerys began to grow distrustful and envious of his hand, believing that he was trying to supersede his own power with the power of House Lannister. And the successes of his hand gnawed at the king, turning him into a jealous and spiteful man, whose gratitude for his friend's service to his kingdom began to sour as the years passed. The tension between the two would only grow after Tywin married the one person in his life who was able to bring him joy, Lady Joanna, a woman that Aerys had lusted after during her time serving as a lady-in-waiting to his own wife Rhaella. Yet another source of jealousy for Aerys. Now Tywin's relationship with his wife is interesting, as it was reported that she was the only person who could bring him joy, even making him laugh on 3 separate occasions according to Grand Maester Pycelle. But I have to wonder if some of the joy he felt in her presence wasn't necessarily derived from her person, but because of the crucial role she played in ensuring the future of House Lannister. There's no doubt that Tywin enjoyed a loving relationship with his wife, and enjoyed her company because he had a genuine connection with her. But it stands to reason that her position as the bearer of the children who would ensure the prosperous future of his house played a part in why he enjoyed her so much. For above all else, family is what matters most to Tywin. Though his relationship with Aerys would continue to suffer, from here on out, Tywin would experience a joy in his life that he hadn't known prior to being a married man. A joy that was expanded greatly upon the birth of the twins Jaime and Cersei in the year 266 AC. Within that same year, Tywin would receive yet another boon, which came in the form of his blundering father's death, an event which likely caused Tywin some grief, but I'm sure he felt more relief, knowing that his father's inadequacies could no longer plague their house. After his father's death, Tywin even went so far as to have his father's mistress perform a walk of atonement down the streets of Lannisport, punishment for this base-born girl helping herself to his mother's jewels and for being a negative influence on his father. Unfortunately for Tywin's ambitions though, his grasp on power in King's Landing would slowly start to decay after Aerys returned to the city, as now not only did the king harbor ill feelings towards his hand, but he was openly trying to defy him at every turn, ruling against his hand in any decision he made, and replacing council members with men of his own choosing. And when those decisions he ruled against turned out to be folly, he blamed his hand all the same, in order to preserve his own image at the expense of Tywin's legacy. Not only that, but in 273 AC, Joanna Lannister would unfortunately die bringing Tywin's third child Tyrion into the world, an event that many say caused any joy that lived within Tywin Lannister to die that very day. Because of how his son came into the world, by quote-unquote killing the only person that Tywin had likely ever felt true love for, he deeply resented Tyrion for killing his mother to enter the world, and more importantly, because Tyrion was born a malformed dwarf. As I imagine if Tyrion had been born without any afflictions, Tywin would have been quicker to accept him as one of his own, rather than condemn him as a monster. This is an incredibly interesting aspect of Tywin's character though, as his hatred of his son seemingly contradicts everything that he represents. Tywin is a man who could suffer the mockery of countless individuals, including a king, and still find it in himself to ignore all of it, keep his pride, and continue serving these people. An incredibly resilient and stalwart man with a brilliant strategic mind who can't seem to find it in himself to see his son as another member of his family and the value he could bring to his cause. Eventually he does give Tyrion a chance, which we'll cover later on, but for the majority of his life, Tyrion is treated as nothing more than a worthless creature who was only born as a result of the god's spite for the magnificence of Tywin and House Lannister, which is sort of par for the course when it comes to the attitudes of most Westerosi towards people that are born with disabilities. However, though this plays into Tywin's distaste for his son, it ultimately comes down to the fact that his wife perished to birth Tyrion, and as someone who's never found someone he truly loved, a person taking away that person would be an extreme that a man like Tywin is unable to forgive. But we'll cover Tywin and Tyrion's relationship more later on in this video. Now, even though King Aerys mocked Tywin over the death of his wife, Tywin chose to continue his position as Hand of the King, suffering his duty for the sake of his continued interests at court and the good of his family's position. Tywin would continue to act as the faithful servant of his once good friend Aerys Targaryen, hosting a tournament in Lannisport in honor of Prince Viserys' birth. A momentous occasion that Tywin thought would be a good time to attempt to entwine his family with that of royalty that no amount of debt to his household could ever hope to achieve, the marriage of one of his own to a member of the royal family, specifically the heir to the Iron Throne, Rhaegar Targaryen. But as was to be expected, along with Tywin's request to have his son Jaime serve as squire to Rhaegar, King Aerys refused this match, adding with his refusal a pointed statement about how the daughter of a servant to the king has no place marrying the king's heir. However, the lion doesn't concern himself with the opinions of the sheep, even if those sheep happen to be wearing the skin of a dragon. And Tywin continued in his duty as Aerys' mental state declined, surely realizing that serving his hand afforded him better opportunities in his endeavors than surrender to Aerys' jokes would. An event would occur a year after this tournament that would forever alter the already shifting dynamic in King's Landing: the Defiance of Duskendale. Taking King Aerys hostage, Dennis Darklyn, the Lord of Duskendale, sought to restore his house in the town it ruled over to its former glory by asking the hand of the king to grant Duskendale a charter, one akin to the charter provided to the Dornish many years past. But as Tywin believed this would set a dangerous precedent where autonomy from the crown was concerned, he refused this proposal, and in a grand plot that could be considered close in scope to the cunning of even Tywin Lannister, that is, if it hadn't been so foolish, Lord Darklyn invited the king to hear his proposal in Duskendale, a proposition which the increasingly reclusive Aerys would have surely rebuked had it not been for his hand profusely advising him that he should refuse to see Lord Darklyn. And considering that Aerys was in the habit of doing the exact opposite of what Tywin wanted, he accepted Lord Darklyn's proposal and promptly made his way to Duskendale, where he was interned in its dungeons not long after his arrival. In order to rescue the king, Lord Tywin mustered a force to surround Duskendale, threatening to put every man, woman, and child to the sword, in typical Tywin fashion, as he blockaded the city from both land and sea, despite Lord Darklyn's claims that should anyone breach his walls, he would execute the Mad King. This monumental event in the history of Westeros served as yet another opportunity for Tywin to gain the upper hand in the realm, as whatever the outcome of this event, Tywin would win, no matter what. If Aerys survived Duskendale, business would continue as usual, and considering Tywin came to his aid personally, Aerys would have no cause to question the loyalty of his hand after the fact. And if Aerys died, well, Tywin said it best himself. They had a better king in Rhaegar seated on his horse right next to him, so either way, this moment would prove to be a victory for the Lord of Lannister. However, Tywin was unable to predict just how badly Aerys' imprisonment would affect his deteriorating mental state. And though the king was already slowly slipping into a state of madness, his time spent in the dungeons beneath the Dunfort fractured his mind so totally that he was now fully lost to any efforts to turn his mind from the darkness that had overtaken it. Tywin persisted in his duty, despite the constant interference and suspicion from Aerys, even going so far as to bring Cersei to court in 281 AC as he continued to find a suitable match for her. Tywin suffered Aerys' mad machinations in silence for years after the Defiance of Duskendale, but all that would change when Aerys stabbed at the one thing Tywin valued above all else: his family, and more specifically, its station in the world and the legacy it would leave behind. And Aerys accomplished this by naming Jaime to the Kingsguard, giving him a position that required him to renounce his land and titles and become celibate, depriving Tywin of his heir and the chance to populate his house with more Lannister children from his line, which isn't really true considering he has another son, but that son is a monster to his father, unfit to helm a great house. Unbeknownst to Lord Tywin, this was actually partially his children's fault, as Jaime conspired with Cersei to earn himself a position at court so he could remain with her. But considering that Tywin had no way of knowing this, the blame fell squarely on the shoulders of King Aerys, and though he had weathered countless slights up till this point, this was the final straw that caused Tywin to abandon his king and retire from his position, something that sealed Aerys' fate far more than Robert Baratheon's hammer did. I'm not going to go into too much detail here about Robert's rebellion, as I'm sure the majority of you are quite familiar with it by now, but Tywin showed one of his many advantageous qualities here that I've waited to cover until now, but one that he's displayed already in abundance: patience. Next to Tywin's pragmatism in terms of importance in his success is his patience. You could say that this is a component of his pragmatism, but regardless, Tywin's restraint when it comes to nearly every situation provides him with unending opportunities to succeed where his enemies fail. Throughout this story, we're often told that Tywin is typically the last person to speak when he's engaged in a discussion, a trait that you can find in nearly every wise and effective leader, as not only does this give Tywin the opportunity to hear the opinions of others and reform his own if necessary, but it ensures that he always has the final say in any situation, consolidating the points made by others with his own to determine the most suitable course of action. His patience doesn't only apply to discussions either. Rather, patience can be found in nearly every aspect of Tywin Lannister's life. Take for example his willingness to suffer the jabs and slights aimed at him by King Aerys and his fellow lords. A lesser man might be coaxed into lashing out irrationally at these individuals, harming himself further in the process. But Tywin's unending patience allows him to quite literally choose his battles. He takes drastic action when necessary, as we saw when he eliminated House Tarbeck and House Rain. But those drastic actions are only taken after heavy consideration of the pros and cons of the situation, and are not manifested as a result of a temperamental man raging for blood. And perhaps the best example of Lord Tywin's patience is the way in which he handled Robert's rebellion. In A World of Ice and Fire, Tywin's decision to storm King's Landing is described as being done in service to the realm, a man coming to the aid of the people when they most needed him. But as we've already established, though Tywin might provide aid to others at certain times, he always has an ulterior motive, and asserting that he marched on King's Landing to save the realm couldn't be further from the truth. Choosing to sit on the sidelines until nearly the last minute, Tywin ensured that no matter the outcome of the war, he could present himself as a loyal servant of either side, and if it were Robert who had met this end on the Trident instead of Rhaegar, I'm certain that he would have joined forces with him to suppress the remaining rebels and prove himself a friend of the throne and its heir. And this action provides further proof that Tywin Lannister is willing to do anything and everything to get ahead in life, and no bonds of friendship, alliances, or sense of morality will deter him from doing what is best for his own family. Not to mention that to prove his loyalty to the newly crowned King Robert, he ordered the deaths of a woman and her children to present to Robert as a token of his goodwill. Though I'm sure that Tywin would have found a comfortable place in the court of victorious Targaryens, as luck would have it, Robert's victory was the greatest boon to his ambitions yet, for his desire to directly intertwine himself with the royal family through marriage died when Rhaegar married Elia Martell. But now with the unwed and unpromised Robert sat upon the Iron Throne, his chance to ascend his house to the heights of royalty presented itself once more. And due to both his important position in the hierarchy of Westeros and his brutal show of support for Robert's cause, he was able to secure the marriage of Cersei to the new king, creating from this golden opportunity he was given a Lannister queen. And not just that, but a future Lannister king, a king whose deference to the will of his mother and larger-than-life grandfather would even see to it that a lion be added to his royal standard, an action that a Targaryen would never dare entertain, save for the rebellious Queen Rhaenyra, who quartered her royal standard with the sigils of House Velaryon and Aeryn. And with the end of Robert's rebellion began the most prosperous era for House Lannister, since Tywin had taken the reins of power. Seated at Casterly Rock and ruling as Warden of the West, Tywin would enjoy a life of relative peace, a peace which was disrupted by the Greyjoy Rebellion. But this event didn't last long, and for 9 years after Balon declared himself king, Tywin and the realm would know peace once more. During this time, Cersei would give birth to 3 children with Lannister blood and the Baratheon name, solidifying his family's position in the royal family, a position that was further augmented by the continued reliance the crown had on the gold of Casterly Rock. This is all the essential information we're given about Tywin that helps us understand who he is and how he came to be the man we become more intimate with in the mainline series of books. But now it's time to take a look at his appearances there, where we can really get into the finer details of his character. Now, as I said earlier, Tywin is a man who is able to weather jabs and slights when necessary, if it suits his aims. But when those jabs and slights become dangerous to the continued prosperity of his house, he has no choice but to take action, like with the Tarbecks and the Rains. At the beginning of the first book in this series, and season 1 of the show, Tywin is forced to come to the aid of his son Tyrion, as he's been accused of plotting to assassinate Bran Stark. As even though Tywin's relationship with Tyrion is rocky at best, he isn't a man who would suffer such a heavy insult aimed at the integrity of his family. So, to rouse the Riverlords and goad Ned Stark into starting a conflict, he sends the Mountain to raid the Riverlands with no banners. Covert operations meant to terrify the local populace through raids that are made by supposed brigands that can't be traced back to Lord Tywin, making him able to assert that it was the Riverlords who first started any conflict when they inevitably marshal their forces to demand that Lord Tywin answer for the crimes of his bannermen. Yet another example of Tywin's brilliance where tactics are concerned. However, it's not until Tywin actually marches on the Riverlands personally that we're given any personal encounter with him. And in the book, that happens when Tyrion finds his father's war camp after escaping his imprisonment in the Vale. And this first encounter gives us the perfect opportunity to cover his appearance. As far as the books are concerned, we're given this vivid interpretation of his appearance. Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock and Warden of the West, was in his middle 50s, yet hard as a man of 20. Even seated, he was tall, with long legs, broad shoulders, a flat stomach. His thin arms were corded with muscle. When his once thick golden hair had begun to recede, he had commanded his barber to shave his head. Lord Tywin did not believe in half measures. He razored his lip and chin as well, but kept his side whiskers, 2 great thickets of wiry golden hair that covered most of his cheeks from ear to jaw. His eyes were a pale green, flecked with gold. Now Charles Dance's portrayal is similar in a few different ways, namely in height and build, but his pale green eyes hold no gold within them. His hair is intact, but receding, and he keeps a full beard, yet trimmed thinly. But the most important difference between the two can be found in their mannerisms, specifically their penchant for smiling. We find the show's version of Tywin smiling at many different moments throughout this series, and while they aren't overtly wide or jovial, they're still present nonetheless. His literary counterpart, however, is infamous for how little he smiles, so much so that he's only ever been recorded as smiling 4 times, thrice when his late wife managed to bring him enough joy to cause one, and once when Jaime was born. Otherwise, Tywin doesn't smile at all, and in fact, even a hint of a smile on his hard face is seen as a dreadful proposition, which is best said by Tyrion in Storm of Swords. Every once in a very long while, Lord Tywin Lannister would actually threaten to smile. He never did, but the threat alone was terrible to behold. Such a small detail holds so much weight to it, as when a man's smile hides more malice than mirth, the sight of him alone is enough to inspire terror in nearly anyone. Not to mention that this smile is backed up by a fearsome reputation. Though it's true that the show's version of Tywin smiles more often, Charles Dance still does a great job of portraying the intensity of this man, and aside from small details like this, I believe him to be a near-perfect representation of the character. So while I'll be supplementing our evaluation of his person with any information given to us from the books, we're going to primarily judge Tywin based on the speech patterns and mannerisms we're given in the show. And there's no better place to start than the first time we encounter Tywin in the show, a scene that can't be found in the books, but one that serves as a worthy addition to this story. Here we find Jaime reading the edict sent to Tywin about the crimes of his bannermen, and how he's meant to make his way to court to answer for them as Tywin skins a freshly killed deer, an edict that in the books was instead given directly to the Mountain and not to Tywin himself. Since we've already become somewhat familiar with Tywin's brand of tactics in the previous sections, this information might seem redundant, but for the majority of people who enjoy this series, this is their first impression of Tywin, and the impression he gives is one of a stern and haughty man, one who isn't afraid to get his hands dirty, which is shown to us both when he's speaking with his son, and quite literally, as he plunges his hands directly into the carcass of a dead animal. Here he chastises Jaime for attacking Ned Stark, pointing out the inherent disadvantages that come with making such a bold and rash decision. As we covered earlier, Tywin is a man who has a plan for every eventuality, and he always takes the time to consider the potential upsides and ramifications that are present in any given situation. And though again, he isn't afraid to get his hands dirty, he knows that violence should never be the first solution when approaching any situation. There were far too many variables present in this scenario that could have afforded Tywin and his house several advantages depending on how they approached it, as there was plenty of political maneuvering that could have been accomplished here prior to Jaime's decision to engage Ned Stark in open combat. The other problem Tywin has with Jaime's actions is the fact that what he did was a half measure, something that the brutally thorough Tywin doesn't believe in. As while he believed Jaime confronting Ned Stark in the first place was an unwise decision, Tywin knows that even an unwise decision has its perks. And had Jaime taken the life of Ned Stark in that moment, not only would he have eliminated a dangerous rival to their house, but killing him could have also been construed as being an honorable thing to do, considering that Ned's wife had taken his brother hostage, and with Ned dead, that would allow the Lannisters to fully control the narrative surrounding that situation. But with Ned alive to sing the song of treason by accusing Jaime of committing crimes against the hand of the king, and by extension the crown, this forces Lord Tywin to play his hand in a specific way, and eliminates any options he had prior to this occurrence. This is also our first encounter with Tywin's commanding way of speaking. Tywin never uses a few familiar phrases when asking a person to do something, like telling them they should or could do something. And he never requests anyone to do anything by suggesting something to them, or asking if they'll do something for him. No, Tywin tells people what to do, and he doesn't offer you his opinion on any matter. He exerts his will, and expects the person he's speaking to follow his orders, leaving little room for questions on the matter at hand.
We'll bring the cattle in Stark's girlhood home, and remind her that Lannisters pay their debts.
Oh, that's not an opinion, it's a fact.
You've served as a glorified bodyguard for 2 kings. I need you to become the man you were always meant to be. Not next year, not tomorrow.
Notice how every time Tywin speaks here, he is in complete control of the conversation, and part of the reason this works so well for him is because of his fearsome reputation. but a reputation attached to a person of no substance has no use, and Tywin's commanding presence alone is enough to cow most people into submitting to his will, especially members of his own family. Now, his manner of speaking isn't the only thing that contributes to his intimidating presence when engaging in conversation, as body language has a great deal to do with it as well. Keeping his back to Jaime as he speaks to him, Tywin appears only marginally concerned with the conversation taking place, and more so with the activity he's currently engaged in, and he uses this tactic to subtly convey to the people he's conversing with that whatever matter they find to be important holds little weight when compared to even the most menial tasks that he's currently performing. Actions taken to further unnerve the person he's speaking to in order to undermine their personal agenda in favor of his own. When he does decide to pause what he's doing to address someone directly, he makes sure to look them in the eyes with an unflinching stare that causes further unease. And when he's ready to make his final point, he gets close to them and gives them the same stare, issuing his final command or assaults on their character to immediately cow them into acting according to his will. The final push in an already Tywin-dominated conversation that seals it with fear. This use of body language to instill fear into his conversational opponent isn't always used by Tywin, but his blunt language nearly always is, and along with his use of stern commanding words, we often find Tywin to be quite condescending, as we see in his introduction in the book and the second scene we see him in the show. Once Tyrion presents himself at the Lannister war camp, in typical Tywin fashion, he receives him coldly, remarking that the rumors of his demise were unfounded, proceeding afterwards to gloat about Jaime's accomplishments on the battlefield thus far, whilst ridiculing his son for his shortcomings, comparing him to his brother, and remarking that Jaime wouldn't have allowed himself to be captured. Obviously, Tywin acts this way here because of his severe distaste for his son, but he talks this way with nearly everyone else as well, and as everything we've covered regarding Tywin's personality so far can be found in almost every scene he's in throughout this story, I will be mentioning these components briefly as we move forward, but to point out every instance of his quirks in detail would be redundant. Now, a welcome change made in the show are the scenes we get involving Arya and Tywin. As though watching Roose and Arya interact in the books is interesting, the chance we're given to delve more into Tywin's character here is invaluable when looking into his person. But before we continue talking about Tywin and Arya, I'd first like to mention something that we've only briefly touched upon so far, and that's Tywin's willingness to have veritable human monsters in his employ. The Mountain is obviously the most well-known, and we get to see the brutality of another in the second season, Sir Amory Lorch. But in the books, there's another person and group who causes unending misery for others on the orders of Lord Tywin, Vargo Hoat and his brave companions, characters that are replaced by Roose Bolton's men, led by Locke in the show. All three of these men and their retinues serve the same purpose. They brutalize others on the orders of Lord Tywin. Now, you can't blame a leader for every war crime committed by their side, but because Tywin directly orders these men to do what they do, we certainly can in this instance. Tywin allowing these men to act the way they do harkens back to the way he handled the Rain Tarbeck revolt, ordering these men to burn, pillage, and kill to incite fear into his enemies, lay waste to their supplies, and reduce their ranks with impunity. Not to mention that Sir Amory and the Mountain are the ones who killed Rhaegar's children during the storming of King's Landing. With that aside, let's get back to the scenes with Tywin and Arya. The first big takeaway here is that even Lord Tywin enjoys the company of others, and he says as much to Arya at one point. We aren't given anything close to this relationship in the books, and depending on how you feel about the joyless Tywin we're given there, these scenes might be too far out of character for him, and I partially agree, considering how stern he's supposed to be. But I think this relationship, and what Tywin reveals to Arya during his conversations with her, add a few great elements to his character that enhance it greatly. For example, the scene where he talks to Arya about teaching Jaime to read reveals something about Tywin that you probably wouldn't assume about him otherwise if he hadn't told this story here. That being that not only does he care about his family's position in the world, but he actually cares about them enough to perform his role as a father in more ways than just giving his children expectations to meet and having his servants take care of the rest. Granted, his son being able to read is absolutely crucial if he's one day going to inherit the title of Lord of Lannister. So you could say that Tywin is still performing this duty with the future of his house in mind, but this story still reveals that at one point in time, Tywin did have a more personal connection to his children. The last conversation he has with Arya reveals another contradiction in Tywin's character, but a contradiction that makes quite a lot of sense. Tywin tells Arya that the War of Five Kings will be his last war, and win or lose, it's this war that he'll be remembered for. His success or failure in this endeavor will be his legacy. A person's legacy is partly made from the facts of their life, their accomplishments, deeds, misdeeds, and their overall character. But one's legacy is often judged differently depending on who's looking at it, which means that a person's legacy is also comprised of something that Tywin claims to pay no mind to: opinions. Aegon I conquered the Seven Kingdoms and established a dynasty that lasted almost 300 years, and to some, he's remembered as the man who united the Seven Kingdoms under one banner, bringing peace to a fractured realm of petty kings and feuding lords. But to others, he's a beast who invaded a land that he had no right to claim with 3 hellish monsters that proceeded to massacre countless people, all for the sake of establishing his own kingdom. As much as Tywin claims otherwise, he very much cares about the opinions of others, even if those opinions can be construed as fact, like when he's speaking to Jaime and comments on their house's position and how they're no longer a house to be feared if one of their own can be taken with impunity. And in the books, we even see him requesting that a letter be burned declaring that Joffrey was a bastard, commanding the recipient of the letter, Sir Harys Swift, to never speak of such filth again, an action that doesn't befit a man who pays no mind to what others think. If there were any Lannister who could have claimed to not care about the opinions of others, it would have been Tywin's father, Tytos Lannister, a man who suffered insult with a laugh and likely forgot he had been insulted shortly after. If Tywin truly didn't care what others thought of him, he'd be a man like his father, but he's not. He's a man who will do anything to make sure that his family is powerful, wealthy, and feared, and in order to do that, one needs to be mindful of their actions and how they present themselves to others in order to shift their opinions of them the way they desire. And though he'd never claim he cared one way or the other, the fact that he's concerned with his legacy and the impact it will have on future generations of House Lannister shows that he indeed does. Fortunately for Tywin, his legacy becomes quite secure after the Battle of Blackwater, a decision that was actually forced upon Tywin here, rather than one he made freely, as George Martin laid out in a response to a fan letter in July 1999, where he stated that Tywin's decision to march on King's Landing was a calculated gamble, as after securing the throne for his grandson by defeating Stannis, Tywin enters the last phase of his life. The phase of his life where the throne is sat securely by a Lannister, and all around him lie Lannisters and their sycophants to ensure that this throne forever stays a fixture of his house. Striding into a throne room atop a brilliant white horse, a horse that defecates on the floor of the throne room just as freely as Tywin plays with the nobles of Westeros, we see a man who now has a firmer grasp on absolute power than he's ever had before. Earlier in this video, we discussed how Tywin views people not as people, but cogs in the machine he's running, and though we've been exposed to his demands for his family's fealty to his will when looking at his relationship with Tyrion so far, it's after he assumes his role as Hand of the King to Joffrey, where we really get to see how much power he has over his children and grandchildren. There's a term used to describe a parent who thinks only of themselves when engaging with their children, a narcissistic parent, and Tywin fits the bill. A narcissistic parent is someone who is so full of themselves that they don't have the capacity to view their children as anything more than a possession. Narcissistic parents often enjoy their children when they're young, but once they've aged to the point where they begin to form their own opinions and defy their parents, a narcissistic parent begins to detest their children and their opposition to their own desires. Tywin isn't a rosy person to be around by any means, and he doesn't enjoy the company of virtually anybody. But as we learned earlier, he did seem to show interest in his children when they were younger, and he enjoyed the company of Arya, a child. But now that they've aged, the most that his children can expect to get from their loving father is a command. Tywin's narcissism is interesting though, as rather than being a person who's full of himself, his vanity is centered more around his house. I can't imagine Tywin getting off on his own reflection, but I can imagine him exacting great pleasure from hundreds of Lannister banners fluttering in the wind on a battlefield, or feeling immensely pleased with himself whenever anyone shows reverence for his family. Regardless of how deep-seated his narcissism is, everyone around him is made to suffer his vain self-importance, and this self-importance is present in his continued struggle to make his house the supreme power in Westeros, which he's much closer to accomplishing now than he was prior to the Battle of the Blackwater, as I mentioned earlier. But with a war raging, 3 out of the 7 kingdoms still in open rebellion, another neutral one who holds contempt for the Lannisters, and the rumors about Joffrey's parentage still persisting, there's still an enormous amount of work left to do before the power of House Lannister is completely secure. But with new alliances with House Martell and Tyrell, and a new renewed position as Hand of the King, come certain new opportunities, as not only is Tywin Hand this time around, but he's given the opportunity to truly rule, where before under Aerys, he was only able to partially exert his overwhelming power, as Aerys would try to undermine him at every turn. With a figurehead on the throne, Tywin can now not only consume the royal family and make it his own, but the entire realm as well. plans for which he immediately begins implementing by betrothing Tyrion to Sansa and Cersei to Loras, or Willis in the books, a character that's absent from the show. In doing so, he claims 6 of the 9 realms of Westeros for House Lannister, the north under Tyrion and Sansa, the reach under Loras and Cersei, the west under himself, which is a position he plans to give Jaime after he convinces him to leave the Kingsguard, Dorne for Myrcella and Trystane, thanks to Tyrion, the Stormlands under Tommen once he's dealt with Stannis, and of course the Crownlands, due to his progeny sitting on the Iron Throne. Not only that, but Lord Baelish is sent to secure the Eyrie, and in the books, he's named Lord Paramount of the Trident, ensuring that wherever a person steps foot in Westeros, they tread on lands friendly to, or claimed by, House Lannister, save for the Iron Islands, which I'm sure doesn't bother Tywin all too much. But of course, a good part of the claims House Lannister has to these lands are in name only until the war is done, a war that comes ever closer to ending after Tywin conspires with the Lords Frey and Bolton to implement one of the most heart-wrenching actions we bear witness to in this story, the Red Wedding. With this singular act, Tywin destroys the northern threat to the south and puts a figurehead in place to rule the north until Sansa and Tyrion's child comes of age. Yet another brutally efficient move on the part of Tywin. A move that, as brutal as it is, actually ends up saving more lives than it ends up taking, as Tywin points out when discussing this issue with Tyrion, where he challenges him to explain why it's more noble to kill 10,000 men in battle than a dozen at dinner, to which Tyrion responds by challenging his father in turn on his intentions, asking him if he did this in order to save lives, which of course he didn't. He did it to, quote, protect the family, or more appropriately, himself and his aspirations for his family. Again, Tywin may have the right of the situation here, as war is a dirty business that costs thousands of lives, and if one can take an action that will save thousands of lives at the expense of a few others, it's like that you should. But there's 2 important distinctions to be made here that prevent this from being done with any sort of good in mind. The first, of course, being that Tywin doesn't care morally one way or another if 10,000 men were to die in battle. He might care because that would be a loss of 10,000 men that he could otherwise use for other purposes, but he personally doesn't care for them or their families. The second thing to consider here is that this act wasn't done on behalf of some liberation effort. This act was done in order to secure the power of a house that wishes to dominate the entire continent of Westeros. The good guys didn't obtain a victory here, and the outcome of this event, and a Lannister victory in this war, only furthers the power of one family at the expense of everyone else, though surely the realm would prosper in some way for a time, just as it did for a time under Tywin's leadership, when he was Hand of the King to Aerys. But unfortunately for Tywin, the war still rages, even after this misdeed, and he has many obstacles blocking his path that have nothing to do with the war. He had the Tyrells trying to steal Sansa, Prince Oberyn arriving in King's Landing to exact justice on House Lannister, and the Mountain. He has his own children, opposing his designs for them. All of these things are dealt with in time for the most part, but time brings even more problems with it, and one surfaces quite quickly after the Red Wedding, during the Golden Wedding, the death of King Joffrey, only this is yet another boon rather than a problem. Joffrey was a woefully ineffectual and cruel king, and had he lived, it was likely that as soon as Tywin were to die, the realm would suffer, just as it had during the later years of King Aerys' reign, as it's doubtful that Joffrey would have grown out of his psychopathy, growing into an adult that would have been capable of causing more misery for Westeros than we could imagine. That problem is solved with the ascension of Tommen though, who by all accounts would serve as a good king, with the help of his advisors of course. A loss has been suffered, in that Tommen will no longer be heir apparent to Storm's End, but it's still possible that he could claim the title while still being king, and his children would undoubtedly assume the position once he's had any. All was falling into place for Tywin and House Lannister, and it was looking as if the foreseeable future would be dominated by lions. But now we've arrived at the final stage of Tywin's life, a stage of his life that didn't have to be his final one, but is for one reason: the way he's treated his youngest son, Tyrion. We've talked a bit about Tywin's relationship with his son throughout this video, but now it's time that we delve into that relationship fully. As you know, Tywin despised Tyrion from birth, blaming him for the death of the only person he had ever truly loved, an act which the wrathful Lord Tywin was unable to forgive. I don't imagine that Tywin was the most pious man, but like nearly everyone else in Westeros, he did believe in the gods, in combination with his love for his late wife, that made him unable to forgive his son, as he viewed him as a punishment sent by the gods to show him humility, making him able to directly blame his son for his wife's death, no matter how irrational that belief is. Because of this belief, he would torment his son for the entirety of his life, more than anyone else that he tormented, giving him menial jobs like putting him in charge of all the drains and cisterns in Casterly Rock when he came of age, and he ridiculed him for being the good-humored person that he was, one that liked to make jokes, and perform the acrobatics taught to him by his uncle Garyon. Then, of course, is the worst thing Tywin subjected his son to, aside from his trial, the forced gang rape of Tyrion's new wife, and how he made Tyrion watch and participate in it. I'm sure we're all familiar with the story, but I'd like to read it for you how Tyrion told it to Shae in the books. When I was 13, I wed a crofter's daughter, or so I thought her. I was blind with love for her, and thought she felt the same for me, but my father rubbed my face in the truth. My bride was a whore Jaime had hired to give me my first taste of manhood, and I believed all of it. Fool that I was. To drive the lesson home, Lord Tywin gave my wife to a barracks of his guardsmen to use as they pleased, and commanded me to watch, and to take her, one last time, after the rest were done. One last time, with no trace of love or tenderness remaining. So you'll remember her as she truly is, he said. After he was done with her, my father had the marriage undone. It was as if we had never been wed, the Septon said. For a father to subject his son to this is horrendous, and thereafter, I have no doubt that Lord Tywin lost what little faith in his youngest son he had. From here on out, Tyrion would do all that he could to prove that his father was right about him, that he was a lecherous imp whose purpose in life was to spend, drink, and whore until he found himself an early grave. Something happened though that caused Lord Tywin to view his son in a different light. The capture of Jaime. This part is left out in the show, but after Tywin names Tyrion acting hand of the king in the books, he thinks to himself that his father is preparing for the worst, that Jaime has been captured and will never return. And now if that's the case, Tyrion was the only son he had, and as we know, family is the only thing that matters to Tywin, and the only one left to continue his legacy is the monster that he's despised since the day he was born. So, he gives Tyrion a chance, and Tyrion does a splendid job with that chance. He sets King's Landing on the right course, manages to control Joffrey to an extent, and he organizes the best possible defense he could of King's Landing, even going so far as to command the defense from the front lines. These accomplishments may have earned Tyrion a great amount of praise from his father, if it hadn't been for one sorry stipulation Lord Tywin had made before sending him off to perform his duty, that being his demand that Tyrion not take Shae to court. Because of this, he was only partially recognized for his achievements, as he was still rewarded with a high position in the royal court, and a match to a woman of noble birth. But these rewards were in fact duties, and they're markedly inferior when compared to the work he put in, and his father was well aware of that. But the worst of it comes during Tyrion's trial for murdering Joffrey. Whether or not Tywin was fully aware that his son didn't murder Joffrey is unknown, but he was very much willing to judge him guilty of committing this crime all the same. Perhaps to show that he may have believed him after all, Lord Tywin was gracious enough to give his son the option of taking the black if he confessed, something that Tyrion was willing to do in exchange for his life. But ever the spiteful man who seeks to totally ruin his enemy, Tywin had to get in one last bitter jab at his son before removing him from his sight for the rest of his life. And that jab came in the form of Shae, the woman Tyrion had come to love during the course of this story, a woman he had to send away across the sea to ensure that she wouldn't be killed by his family. In the show, we see Tywin take Cersei aside and request that Shae be brought to his chambers before the royal wedding, and it's perhaps there that he was able to convince her to turn against his son. Regardless, Shae returns to King's Landing on the orders of Tywin, and proceeds to accuse Tyrion of all manner of crimes, before he requests a trial by combat, a trial that unfortunately ends in his father's favor, and that should have been that. Tyrion was to be executed shortly thereafter, and Tywin would have continued to rule the kingdoms in his grandson's stead. However, Tywin's most beloved treasure ended up being his undoing: family. As Jaime, the only person in all of House Lannister who loved Tyrion, comes to his rescue, a second chance that Tyrion used to climb to his father's bedchambers to exact the truth from him before he makes his journey across the narrow sea. Only Tyrion finds Shae in his father's bed, a direct contradiction of Tywin's virulent opposition to prostitutes, and afterwards, Tywin, alone on the privy, is made to answer for the crimes committed against his son and the realm, suffering a shot through the gut with a quarrel, stating that Tyrion is no son of his. But as Tyrion points out, he is his son, telling Tywin that he's his father writ small in the books, a claim that's backed up by his Aunt Jenna in A Feast for Crows, a claim that becomes all the more apparent after we find Shae in Tywin's bed. And that was Tywin Lannister's greatest error, ostracizing his son for his perceived faults and for a crime he didn't commit, shunning the one member of his family that could have ensured the continuation of everything he had built after his demise, a son who was not only gifted with the intelligence of his father, but the tenderness of his forefather, the little lion, who could fit into the gargantuan shoes of his great father, the little lion who tore out his father's heart in the end, and at this end, who was Tywin Lannister. He was a man born into the richest house in all of Westeros, a stern boy, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and the promise of inheriting the great power of a noble house in the future. Unfortunately for Tywin, he was born the first son to possibly the weakest Lannister ever to helm the house, and he spent his youth languishing in the light of his father's constant missteps, an experience that would cause the already hard-natured Tywin to become a joyless man whose entire focus was set on restoring glory to his house. Over the course of his life, Tywin would prove himself to be a hyper-intelligent, austere, and ruthless man who, more than anyone else in his lifetime, decided the course of history in Westeros, making himself a part of nearly every conflict, event, and misfortune that occurred during this time, guiding the realm towards enriching and empowering his own house, no matter the cost to others. All of this he accomplished through his own commanding presence and ironclad will, a man so dead set on reaching his goals that nothing else in the world mattered, a man who shaped himself into the embodiment of ambition and determination. In the beginning of this video, I made the claim that Tywin stands tall above all the other evildoers in this story, and everything we've discussed so far about him has a part to play in that distinction. But there are two things in particular that solidify this notion. The first is that many of the monsters you see in this story, like Joffrey Baratheon, Walder Frey, Roose Bolton, Ramsay Bolton, the Mountain, Amory Lorch, and Vargo Hoat, are all able to commit many of the horrendous acts they commit because they're directly backed by the one man who can give them the power to act on their violent impulses, Tywin Lannister. Sure, they all have the ability to do what they please to a certain extent without Tywin backing them, but that's nothing compared to what they do after they're given the blessing of the Lion Lord. Tywin is the master of monsters, the god of suffering, the man who orders men to put entire villages, cities, and acres of land to the torch, killing thousands of innocents in the process, and depriving others of the resources they need to survive. That alone should be enough to give Tywin the distinction of being the prime evil in this story. But what makes Tywin the worst of the worst is the fact that he manages to make all of these horrible things a reality while being the true king of Westeros. He isn't some rabid lord desperately trying to gain power by haphazard and brutal means. He's the puppet master, the tactician, the financier, the man with the plan who can mold all existing power structures into an extension of his will. There were some lulls in his power, but for nearly his entire life, Tywin Lannister was the true power in Westeros. Figurehead kings were manipulated, the opposition was destroyed, and the realm bled profusely for the power of Tywin and House Lannister. I ask you, what is more terrifying than a man who's willing to lie, cheat, manipulate, kill, and destroy just for the sake of his own power and the power of his family? Ramsay Bolton might flay his victims, Joffrey might cut their heads off and mount them on spikes, and the Mountain may cleave his foes in half with his greatsword, but standing behind all of them to allow their brutal power to flourish is the true king. And a true king doesn't need to show his brutality personally. No, he only needs to let the realm know that every terror that descends upon the populace is a direct result of his influence. The majestic might of a Lion Lord with near absolute power and no mercy, and a man totally in control of evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Tywin? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured in a future episode while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, and to my patrons, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and Reddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.